Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Arthur Brooks, President of the American Enterprise Institute, and I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing our friend, India's Minister of Finance and Corporate Affairs, as well as Information and Broadcasting, Arun Jaitley. From the time he was a student leader in the 1970s and imprisoned for defending democracy, Mr. Jaitley has had a distinguished career in politics and the law. Before becoming India's finance minister in May of last year, he served as the leader of the BJP in the upper house of parliament. At AEI, we have a deep interest in the important India-US relationship. We believe that it is one of the key relationships going forward in the world. We have a deep commitment to it in our work. Our scholar Sadanand Dume stewards this work, spends a lot of time in India, as I do each year myself, as a reflection of our commitment to this. It is for this reason that it is such an honor for us to welcome the finance minister here today. He's going to address one of the most important issues facing Asia and the world, how to ensure that the world's largest democracy lives up to its truly incredible economic potential. So please join me in welcoming to the stage the Finance Minister of India, Arun Jaitley, and resident fellow leading the India South Asia Studies program here at AEI, Sadanand Dume.
Thank you, everybody, for coming here. And I think it's testimony to the finance minister that we have got such a packed hall here on a Friday evening in June. I also wanted to welcome the delegation that is traveling along with the minister, our friends from the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry who have kindly joined us. And also I see two members of the minister's family. So welcome to AEI. And so why don't you start?
Thank you very much, Sadanand. The subject you've asked me to speak on is how does India target the double-digit growth? I've been in the US for the last few days, and I've had a couple of engagements on somewhat similar subjects. But nothing has pointed out as pointed as how do you cover this roadmap between our current 7.5% growth rate and have that extra jump as far as the Indian economy is concerned. We did in fact reach 9% a couple of years ago. And we sustained that 9% growth for almost 3 to 4 years. And before I address the point, I think it may do us a little bit of a good to realize as to what went wrong. That from that 9% growth rate in the last 4 or 5 years, we started declining downwards. Till we reversed the curve last year. India had traditionally got used to, in the age of controlled economy, to a very, very modest rate of growth. In fact, global economists would virtually frown on the idea of India having a faster growth rate in view of the model that we had adopted. Probably in the first 2 decades after independence, we had very few choices for the reason that the availability of capital in India, the availability of entrepreneurship, was somewhat limited. But thereafter, I thought there was a potential. But that potential, because of some thinking on part of the ruling groups, didn't quite take off. And we had a series of decisions which were intended to keep the economy controlled and to grow at a very modest level. In fact, out of sheer sarcasm, our 2%, 2.5% growth rates through that period used to be referred to as the Hindu rate of growth. And that was the comment which was popularly made, and that became an accepted economic phrase. The 70s and the 80s were broadly wasted. I think it was time to switch over, but probably those in power thought otherwise. Till we were compelled upon by the crisis in the early 90s in order to go in for a change. And I think that change was much better. If I recollect my years as a young student or as an early professional, I remember in that controlled economy how we grew. Everything was short. There was transportation was not available, school admissions were not available, number of colleges was small, food grain was inadequate. If you wanted to buy a two-wheel vehicle, you had to wait for 20 years. If you wanted to get a telephone connection, the waiting list would be 15 to 25 years. That's the economy which we grew up in. And there were many people who had serious reservations when we switched over in 1991, and I fully give credit to the then Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, who took a very bold decision because he belonged to a political party which was otherwise had its great faith in the regulated economy. And over the next 10-15 years, we hugely transformed. When I first became a member of Parliament, we used to be given an authority to allocate certain largesse because of shortage. So if somebody wanted a telephone connection, we had an authority to give him a certain number of telecom connections every year, or cooking gas connections. And suddenly, within years of my becoming a member of Parliament, I suddenly realized that these were only wasted pieces of paper because nobody came to us. We switched over to surplus. And that is the advantage India got. We had governments of three different political complexions. We had the Congress government, a United Front government where the left parties were members. Then you had the NDA government by Mr. Vajpayee. But they kept that target on. And the pace may have differed, but they didn't deviate from the roadmap. I think the deviation started in 2004-2005. And the deviation cost us quite a lot. In the first few years, we continued to benefit still from the impetus of the past. But once we lost out on that impetus of the past because the fresh set of reforms were not going on, power structures were outside the government, I identified to myself as to what went wrong. And in this century, to lose out on some valuable time, I think the first thing that went wrong was the Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy must be the natural leader of that country, or at least the party in power. If that is not so, then his authority to take decisions itself doesn't exist. So decisions would be taken outside the government. And outside the government, you had people with somewhat obsolete ideas who probably thought that by just that kind of populism, without concentrating on increased productivity, without concentrating on growth rates, just by redistributing the existing resources, you could do what happened in 1971 and you could repeat it in 2004, 2005. That probably was not to be. The second thing that went wrong was you made a policy shift, and some of the ideas were certainly not conducive to the modern day economy. It was more leftwards. You relished discretions, whereas the rule of law, the power of the Indian judiciary, would never accept those discretions. And therefore, investors who came and invested in India benefited from some of those discretionary exercises of power which was abused, which was exercised for collateral reasons. And the spiral effect was that you had investments which were confiscated, you had contracts which were cancelled, you had licenses which were cancelled, and therefore people became scared of investing in India. As the leader of opposition, I recollect sometimes in 2009 or 2010, getting up in parliament and saying that forget people coming into India, the Indian industry is thinking of investing elsewhere. Our taxation rates were not conducive, our processes were becoming complicated and we were moving backwards. Our discretions which were not acceptable in this time, in this century, were being abused. Our taxation policies were becoming retrograde. You had a situation where the government honestly thought that retrospective taxation in issues on issues could be accepted by the system. You had an ultra-aggressive tax policy which didn't bring us any revenue, but which just scared people away from investing. Infrastructure slowed down. The banking system was 6% NPAs and another 7% stressed assets. So the capacity of banks to lend was going away. The public-private partnership model for infrastructure creation itself had suffered a setback. In fact, one of the most successful areas in infrastructure creation in India in the last 1.5 decades has been the national highways. And suddenly you had dozens of tenders being floated for highways, and not one person would respond because the institution of those who would build these highways himself were getting squeezed. Banks were not lending, people were not coming up. And I think it is at this stage that an aspirational India was becoming increasingly angry and frustrated. And this was evident in the last few years. So that angry and aspirational India defied the basic conventional rules of Indian politics. They voted out everyone who wanted to be elected on the strength of a family charisma. So a large number of political parties, not necessarily the Congress party itself, but even regional parties, which were controlled by political parties or families or individuals, they all got wiped out. Nobody got more than 5 seats in parliament. It was 0 to 5. BSP, JDU, Samajwadi Party. So they almost got wiped out. Caste-based parties almost got wiped out. And I therefore consider 2014 to be an important defining moment because the election in Indian democracy, instead of being on traditional alliances, caste alliances, political alliances, family charismas, became an election substantially on governance issues. And therefore, Indian governance, the management of Indian economy itself became a central stage issue. And that is the reason why the electorate gave a decisive verdict and after 30 years voted almost a single party majority in power. Something which even in our best estimates we didn't thought we could reach. So that was a kind of a surprise for us also. We thought we'd be somewhat short of the majority figure on our own. Along with our allies, we'll cross that majority figure, but we got a majority figure on our own. And with the alliance, we are much bigger than that. And I think having said so as to what went wrong, I think this new aspirational India expects early results. It expects decisive governments. And therefore, when the present government started off, governance as also management of the economy always remained a primary challenge before the government. There were few low-hanging fruits, decisions which are not very difficult. And therefore, those decisions were taken. Now, if these decisions had been taken 5 years and 8 years ago, probably there would have been a controversy. But these were accepted in the natural course by Indian public opinion. For instance, our first decision was we must open out. So we looked at sectors which were erstwhile close to investment, also international investment, and one by one we started opening out. Only one of them required a legislative intervention, that's insurance. And for 10 years we were going up and down without being able to decide. And the others could be done easily by an executive action. Defense could be opened out, real estate could be opened out, investment in townships could be relaxed, medical equipment could be opened out. And we decided to open these out. We had to put up this argument, and therefore at the very outset I put up this argument when the first budget was presented, that these conventional slogans will now have to be rejected. The choice between India is not between being pro-business or pro-poor. The two are interrelated. There is no contradiction between the two. So the government wants to expand businesses, the government wants to enable businesses, and the government wants that part of the increased revenue or enrichment of the government to be spent on infrastructure, spent on poverty alleviation schemes. So the priorities have been defined. We wanted to break off from the decision making which was taking place for corrupt or collateral motives. So government discretions had to be ended, and wherever possible an objective criteria had to be introduced. So we looked at areas, some of which required a legislative intervention, that henceforth all natural resources, coal, mineral, these were separate legislations. Governments have no power to allocate. These are sovereign resources, and therefore they would be allocated by a market mechanism. Everybody has to bid. Now, normally for last 10 years, nothing had been done, but in a period of 4 months, from when the Supreme Court cancelled these allotments, we had a policy in place, we had a legislation in place. In fact, to drive home the point, we allowed those emergency legislative powers, the ordinances, to come in. Some people criticized us that, are you bypassing Parliament? An ordinance doesn't bypass Parliament. For the simple reason, an ordinance has to be subsequently approved by Parliament. Therefore, it gets a post facto ratification. But the object behind the ordinance was the government must show a sense of urgency and therefore must redefine that it wants to move in this direction. And I'm glad with regard to mineral, with regard to coal, with regard to spectrum, which created all the controversies, we had a huge success. There were clean, transparent mechanisms, and people got their allocations within a matter of weeks, and so that they could now concentrate on their businesses itself. What do we do with all this resource which was coming in? Because we got a lot of financial resource. We had realized that Indian federal model was too loaded in favor of the central government. And therefore, the central governments conventionally allowed the regions or the states to always keep coming to the center for discretionary grants or allotments. Now that age is over. That's over. Therefore, every state or region now is entitled in terms of percentage to a certain amount from the central government. I, as finance minister, have no discretionary funds available with me, so I can favor one region or the other. And therefore, the entire income, even out of these natural resources, we said, will go back to the regions where those resources are to be found. Hence, earlier, the states didn't get anything out of these, or got very petty little out of it. And most of these states where coal or mineral wealth of India is located are the poorest regions of India, because the tribals of India live there. And if there is one segment which could be identified as having benefited the least out of the growth process, it was the tribals. So the entire proceeds over the next 30 years from all these natural resources now are being given to the states. And because they've been earned by a market mechanism, the states now get it. I think there are two other important points. foreign direct investment, which in the 90s and the early part of the last century, the last decade, we found there was some resistance, I think has been accepted as a very important additionality of resource in India. And therefore, the resistance against them, even by left groups, is very marginal. And by trade unions is, I think, is just symbolic. And therefore, it's an important acceptability of this change scenario which has taken place. We must now try to ease in the processes of doing business in India. How do we reduce the number of permissions? How do we make sure that environmental permissions are not held pending for years together, so that they must be cleared? How do we ensure that the foreign investment proposals are either automatic or cleared at the earliest? Now, these are changes which have taken place. Some legislations which had been enacted earlier, we are scanning through each one of them so that the complications arising out of those legislations we can do away with. So I would certainly say at this stage, when I look back the last 12 months, easing the processes, both at the center and the states have also joined in because all states are now competing for that resource. And therefore, they are in the process. I don't think we've gone all hog, but that's work in progress as far as that agenda is concerned. Our taxation structures. I think the taxation structures, some were obsolete and some were bringing India a bad name. So we had to take a very bold decision of saying the slab of corporate tax in India will now go down to 25%. And the object was that we must give to the general body of both domestic and international investors a competitive taxation rate, because in our neighborhood, that's what the average taxation rates are. And therefore, if I am going to tax people 10 to 15% more than that, then obviously India loses its attraction as an investment destination. So we are now in the process from the coming days onwards. Every year for the next four years, we'll be gradually bringing down the direct taxation rates in India so as to make our rates competitive, at least with the region, and better than most parts of the world on this side. We've also offered various attractive investments in terms of alternative investment funds. But one of the major reforms we are now undertaken is the indirect taxation. Every state has its own indirect taxes. They have a large number of them. And therefore, transportation of goods or services from one state to another is a problem. Building consensus between these states is highly challenging. And therefore, through the goods and services tax, I broadly succeeded in building a consensus. And I think the most important aspect of the goods and services tax is that 1/6 of the world's population will be one market. Therefore, for any investor in India, both domestic and international, he has a market at hand. There's a seamless transfer of goods and services which will take place. The rates of taxation eventually will come down because a tax on tax itself will not be possible if the GST is implemented. And I think the high point of the GST negotiations in a short period, because for the last 8-9 years it was eluding us, is that when I presented it in the Lok Sabha for approval, the Congress party decided to abstain. For some reason, though they had supported this idea of this bill in the at the earlier stages, they had introduced it. So their abstinence was for political reasons. But every other political party, including their allies, supported this legislation. Now it's important that coal, mineral, GST, all regional parties which are otherwise opposed to us have supported each one of these legislations because the GST will benefit the consuming states, and most consuming states are the ones which are less developed. The coal and mineral resource will go to West Bengal, it will go to Jharkhand, it will go to Orissa, it will go to partly Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, little bit Karnataka and Maharashtra. Now these are the states which all have the tribal pockets. And therefore, you are directly transferring your resources as far as these are concerned. There were a huge number of decisions which have been pending. I won't go into all of them. And just the pendency itself had conveyed an image of indecisiveness. We could easily take the decision to fix up gas prices linked to the actual costs. We were able to hugely cut down in our very first year something which was otherwise regarded as very sacrosanct and populist, the subsidies. Petrol is today linked to the market price. The declining prices have helped us. Diesel is linked to that. We've been able to implement some of the very radical programs about which we had doubts earlier on basis of the DBT. And therefore, the more and more subsidies we've experimented are now going directly by way of cash transfer to the people. So the state support itself and the leakages are getting out of that. Now, all this have created resulted in a much lesser pressure on the revenue itself. For example, I've been mentioning that a reform which could have actually led to a lot of protests has been so smoothly done that in year 15-16, the current year, I'll be spending almost 30% of what was spent 2 years ago on oil subsidies. And that's a huge savings of the exchequer. And all this money is now being diverted into creation of infrastructure. We still have infrastructural challenges because the model itself had cracked. And therefore, we've used the declining oil prices to partly pass the benefit on to the consumers, but kept a slice out of that and converted it into a cess for infrastructure, and therefore the benefit of declining oil prices is now going into highway construction, rural roads construction, and for the railways. In fact, in these three sectors which were starved of funds, this year through various instruments we made such adequate funds available that if these three areas of infrastructure they are able to spend those funds, we'll actually see a movement in the direction of what the title of this discussion today is. We still have a lot of pending work at hand. The land bill is an important challenge. It's still before a joint committee of both houses of parliament, and I think we'll have to fight it out and explain the benefits of the land bill, because it is intended for development of India's rural areas. It's the infrastructure creation in rural areas which will suffer if this bill is not passed. The GST, I am reasonably confident that we'll be able to get a positive recommendation from the committee of the upper house and we'll go through. We have several other reforms in the pipeline. The bankruptcy code, reducing the kind of permissions required for setting up businesses in India, a public procurement law, a law on expeditious adjudication of disputes relating to big projects. The social programs of the government, whether it's the Clean India campaign, it's actually a healthcare program because it's preventive healthcare, have become mass movements and therefore are producing greater results. Now, coming to the specifics of the subject, where do we stand today? Last year, with the final data out, these are provisional figures, India grew by 7.3% in terms of GDP. In terms of fiscal deficit, from an all-time high of 6% plus, we brought it down to 4%. I could have brought it down lesser this year, but I've consciously given a pause here because we want to take a lot more money and spend it on infrastructure. Our current account deficit last quarter was 0.2. which is quite an exciting figure for us. It'll be, the year's average is 1.3. This year we hope to try and do better than that. Capital formation has improved. Some trickling effect on these infrastructure areas has just about started. Power sector has performed quite well, and with the coal and the renewable energy programs that we have, in fact today we, probably for the first time in history, we have surplus power, and therefore if the industry or more townships need that power, it's available, provided there are takers for it. What is now the further roadmap to improve upon this? I cannot say as to what figure India's growth would achieve. But I'm certainly of the view that this 7.5% growth that we are presently at is not India's optimum potential. We've reached this in the backdrop of a terrible monsoon last year, where you had a second round of crop destruction in the month of March because there was a very bad hailstorm which impacted on 8 states. You had a manufacturing sector which was almost crawling. You had growth rates of sub 5%. And when you take off from there, if you break up the Indian economy, services have consistently been 9 to 10%. And therefore, that's not an area which governments have much to worry about. Unless governments act as obstructionists, it's an area which is going to grow with the kind of huge manpower resource available in India and trained human minds, the quality of entrepreneurship. This sector is expanding, and it has a very significant impact on our GDP. Our manufacturing was almost flat at one time. Last year's figures indicate it's around 7.1%. And the first 2 months this year indicate from the revenue figures, particularly of indirect taxation, that there is a significant improvement over last year. Now, with a lot more money being invested in infrastructure and governments even conducting their fiscal policy in order to help the manufacturing sector, there is a significant growth possible as far as this area is concerned. And therefore, the Make in India program plus concentration on manufacturing, the impact of all these coal mine auctions, mineral auctions, because these are all works in progress where the impact is seen on the ground as to how it functions, I think in the coming years is going to up India's manufacturing sector significantly. We've also come out with a huge program to help much smaller units. You see, large industry in India creates a job, but the real jobs are created by those small and micro units. We have almost 57 million of them, 5.77 crore. And they create about 11 crore, that's 110 million jobs in India. And these are the unfunded segments of the Indian economy. So we've set up an agency called the Mudra Agency, which will now transform into a bank, whose principal job will be to invest funds in this sector, so that jobs are created in this sector. And it adds, these are ancillary units, small units which come up. These are also trading units which come up. You then have agriculture. And I must confess that this is an area which is almost in near distress situation. In agriculture, you have amongst the land owning people a lot of underemployment. Agriculture is not remunerative enough. And you have almost 300 million people who live in rural areas who are the landless labor. So one of the great challenges is going to be, how do you bring people out of this sector and create alternate jobs for them? This is exactly what our amendments to the land law intend to do. They promote irrigation projects, they promote rural electrification, they promote rural roads, they promote suburban centers, suburban townships, low-cost housing, affordable housing. And these are the areas which they promote. And these areas are almost, land is made unavailable from them under the 2013 law. And that's the amendment. One more significant part of this amendment is to allow industrial corridors to pass through rural areas. Now, once these industrial corridors pass through rural areas and generate employment for the youth there, that is one way over the next 10, 20 years of getting people out of these areas. Hopefully, with a better monsoon this year, at least that's the trend which has defied the predictions of the meteorological department so far. Agriculture must do better. That not only increases the agricultural growth rate, but it also has an impact on the rest of the economy because the rural purchasing power goes up. At the moment, we are faced with a situation where traditional commodities which agricultural economies purchase, for instance, the car sales are up, the truck sales are up, but the two-wheelers and the tractors are down, which means last year's distress in agriculture is impacting on them. Now, it will have a spiral effect on other segments of the economy. It will also improve the growth rates as far as this section is concerned. Two more factors. One relating to the goods and services tax. It has a potential to put up, economists say 2%, but I'll be quite happy if it pushes up with half that figure, the GDP of India. And once we are able to bring that reform, and I am reasonably certain that this reform is now coming, it's only a matter of time as to when it's implemented, I think will have a positive impact. So agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure, investment in irrigation. Now this is important, and I have learnt a lesson from at least 3 states in India, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh and Andhra Pradesh, which invested in irrigation and almost produced instant results. Madhya Pradesh created a river grid, and the impact of that river grid is in the last 3 years, its agriculture has grown by 18%, 20% and 22%. That's the impact irrigation projects are having in these areas. Part of the Gujarat story in the rural areas was also because of the Narmada water and the check dams, the small irrigation projects which were created in that state. Similarly, in Andhra Pradesh, what YSR did was, his great political success was through the irrigation programs that he implemented in the state. Therefore, with revenues now moving up, that's the area of investment which we are looking at. So besides these areas in the GST, 2 more last factors. Hopefully the global winds will improve, and therefore its impact on international trade, our own exports and our trade, it aids the GDP. Today we are reaching that 7.5. This year, even without these factors, we hope to touch about 8%. And therefore, once the impact of all these changes and investments is felt, I think there could be a significant growth. Inflation in India, I think, has been under control. I must say to the credit of the central bank that faced with a 11.5% inflation situation a few years ago, they've consistently kept it below 5%. The wholesale index is almost in the negative. And if inflation stays in the negative, or if inflation stays at moderate levels, one should logically expect the interest rates to go down. And interest rates will directly impact on the efficiency of the Indian economy. They'll add, at present interest rates, manufacturing is a challenge. And therefore, once interest rates goes down, the manufacturing sector gains. One sector which has suffered adversely and which is a great driver of Indian economy is real estate. So an economy which has a plan to create 100 smart cities. We are almost at a stage where we are looking for each smart city for a joint venture partner. We are on the takeoff stage, where suburban townships around major towns have been coming up, and people in large numbers from these rural areas, more aspirational people have been migrating into those houses. Today, because of high rates, thousands and thousands of those apartments have still not been purchased. So hopefully, as we keep inflation under control, I think these drivers of the economy are going to pick up. And therefore, once the cumulative effect of all these plus some favorable global winds, I think the journey between 8% and 10% is not an impossible journey. It's reasonably plausible. And I think that is where India's real potential is. But the last point I'd like to mention that it's not, it's important that we reach that target, but it's more important that we sustain it for a couple of years. And it's only if we are able to sustain it for a couple of years that I think we'll be able to have the direct benefits of growth as far as India is concerned, more jobs, better economy, and hopefully over the next 10 years or so, deplete the poverty levels in the segments which are most impacted by it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks. Thank you for that masterful overview that was both political and economic. I'm going to start with a question which I think is particularly appropriate since we're at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a question of politics. When this government was elected with the first single-party majority in 30 years, we saw many comparisons in the international press. And one of the comparisons one came across quite often was the idea that this was going to be India's Reagan moment or Thatcher moment. By that, I don't think anybody meant that the Indian economy would be exactly like the American economy or the British economy. But there was a sense that because there was so much political capital, what could be done, and particularly done early, was make painful decisions that other governments would not have been able to do in order to gain long-term payoffs. Some of the examples that come up would be, for instance, there's been a lot of talk for years about privatizing loss-making companies. The state-owned bank situation has come up, urea subsidies and so on. So when you describe this path to 10%, it seems as though in an Indian context, these gains can be made, unless I'm misinterpreting it, without that kind of political pain. How would you approach that?
I would first respond with a comment. When you take the models as the Reagan moment or the Thatcher moment, related to India. Now, privatization, I am a great votary of privatization. I was the first minister for disinvestment in India for the few months, and the first unit in India was disinvested under my signatures. But having said that, that itself may not address my problem of this 25 to 30% people below the poverty line, and some of them in a distressed situation. Privatization program of the government or the disinvestment program of the government will go on. For instance, in my very first year, disinvestment was almost not visible because the government was doing so much. But let me tell you on a statistic, even last year, even when there was very little evidence of any divestment, I was able to divest in terms of money value the largest single that India has done in any given year. So without creating the controversies of 2000 to 2004, I had a much larger amount last year without anybody having noticed it from the divestment program of the government. And this year, I intend to improve that figure by almost 2.5 times. So it will go on. There will be a number of units which we have shortlisted. The hotels, some loss-making units, some probably are incapable of even being privatized. And therefore, we would look at strategic sales. Therefore, in the budget, I have strategic disinvestment, I have mentioned it there itself. But these are only symbols. This program will go on. But then the problems that India has are much larger. We have to balance higher growth rates along with a concern. No government in India ever could remain itself unconcerned with that 25-30%. And therefore, you have to, I've been saying since yesterday, blend it with very prudent politics. So that prudent politics is not just give a handout to people or just distribute some money during the election year as the UPA has done, because that's no long-term impact on the economy. We've already got a couple of social security schemes in play, and they've had a resounding impact. But we could never think of India having an insurance cover for poor people, where 110 million people buy policy in 1 month. Now, these are unprecedented figures, and these are partly state supported. Partly people pay for it themselves. There are 2 others I am working on. So insurances, pensions, financial inclusions, healthcare for senior citizens, crop insurance for farmers, which have been very ineffective. Now, these are all areas which we are working on. And therefore, when you have to address the problems of Indian economy, one, you have to target higher growth rates with a liberalized policy, but you can't lose sight of the social conscious of the decision makers. So you will have to blend it with concern for those about whom you should be concerned.
Next question is really about, this is something that you may not recall, but we had discussed the last time you were in Washington several years ago as leader of the opposition, which is the evolution of the BJP. One of the things you spoke about when in your comments was how before 1991 there was a completely different mindset, and then in 1991 India embraced reform. One of the things that's interesting has been at the same time the evolution of economic thinking in your party. In the 90s, for instance, there were many people in the party who were not great votaries of liberalization. There was an association with organizations like the Swadeshi Jagran Manch. Today, you have a prime minister who was elected based on the success of the Gujarat model. We have a finance minister who stands for growth and productivity. How has this, what has happened within your party, and are these changes permanent in your belief?
I think there is no other alternative that India has. Gone are the days where India could go back to a regulated economy. Gone are the days where you can put any form of reform process on the side without concentrating on improving upon efficiencies, growth, and just consider yourself redistributing resources. So you'll be repeating what happened from 2008 to 2014, and that's a disastrous situation. I think BJP became, over the last 25 odd years, where we repeatedly won elections in states, as almost a natural party of governance. And therefore, the experience of our states has helped in the evolution of the whole process. We were never a party of state controls. So if you look at the Janasangh resolutions of the 50s and the 60s, we were for a more liberalized economy even during the days of regulation. But then as you got to understand and feel where the shoe pinches, this experience of the last 25 years where we've been winning in various states of chief ministers emerging as leaders, I think did us a lot of good. The Prime Minister's own experience in Gujarat, I think certainly added valuable experience to him. And also our experiences in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh. I think Madhya Pradesh is the other test case where we've transformed a whole state, which was otherwise considered a Bimaru or a sick state.
I'm going to open it up. I think that perhaps does Congresswoman Gabbard have a question to start with? As I open it up, could you just wait for the mic one moment? The mic is coming to you.
Thank you very much, Minister. It's great to welcome you back here to Washington and to hear your assessment on things. Since I visited you in India last December, I heard great excitement there in India that reflected a similar excitement here in the United States in seeing how we can build more bridges that are mutually beneficial. I think the interest from U.S. businesses and investors in looking towards opportunity in India continues to grow. I think as you outlined some of the challenges previously, though, those perceptions still exist about how to deal with the bureaucracy in a way that creates certainty as business plans are put in place and investments are made. And I'm wondering if you can speak about how the government of India is addressing that perception and building confidence in investors to attract them to come in.
You see, the investors are very competent and clever people. So they don't come in only on persuasion. They look at facts, they look at the overall scenario, and therefore our job really is to create an environment in India, both in terms of an enabling environment and also create a vision for the future where an investor certainly feels that there is stability of regime, there is stability of policy, there's a fair taxation, there's a possibility of much higher profitability, and therefore in a scenario where the global economy is at a very modest level, this is one economy which stands out, which is growing, and probably the growth momentum will be maintained through policy. And I think once you convey this impression, and the impression can't merely be communicated, every investor cross-checks on his own. He has people in India, he has the best advisors itself, and it's at that stage that they decide to invest. And I think it's here that we are getting response. At the same time, on basis of experiences of the past, the investors have some legitimate concerns. And therefore, it's equally important for me to absorb those concerns. And one of the concerns has been that investors don't like uncertainty. And therefore, in terms of maturity in governance and stability of policy, we have to make sure that a regime of uncertainty is not created.
Let me push you back on that. One of the things you spoke about when you were in opposition was ending the idea of tax terrorism. And it's certainly true that your government has done many things in that regard, including not appealing judgments that went against Vodafone and Shell, trying to simplify the code and so on. But one of the things that comes up over and over, and I think this came up yesterday also in New York, what people ask is, why not simply scrap what I think was your predecessor's worst law, the retroactive tax? Why not just say, we're ending this, it was a bad law, we don't think this bad law should be on the books, because that will create much more confidence than simply saying we don't like the law.
That was a possible option. And we examined various options. My option was not my predecessor's option to say, well, my party doesn't have a majority on its own, so I didn't do it. But along with your allies, you had more seats than me. You could have done it. I do believe that the law per se was an unfair law. And we haven't changed that position. How do we minimize the adverse impact of that law? So we held out an assurance, which we've lived up to, that the present government will not use taxation powers of Parliament to enact retrospectively. We haven't done that. 2, even under the old law, nothing fresh would be done. Nothing fresh has happened. So not a single notice has been issued, nor is it likely to be issued. So it remains merely that 1 or 2 companies have pending litigations which were born much before this government came to power. So I had at this stage, having virtually neutralized the impact of the law for the future, only to address the past, the footprints which my predecessors left behind. You could do it by just repealing the law, or you could do it by allowing the judicial tribunal to adjudicate upon it. Now, by repealing the law, I would necessarily have to go to the legislature and tell them here is a pending dispute. I want to legislate in order to decide this dispute against the government of India. The government felt that that may not be the best course open, considering the reality of Indian politics. And therefore, while neutralizing it for the future, we wait for a judicial tribunal, just as the Vodafone 2 or the Shell positions got upheld by a court and we endorsed it by a cabinet decision to say we accept these decisions, we are not going to appeal to it. So one part of litigation relating to transfer pricing we just put to an end. We put a quietus to this. So I'm looking for a methodology where I can, without stirring a controversy, put a quietus to the whole issue.
Questions? Why don't I? Gentleman over there in the corner, and could you please identify yourself and keep it as a question? Thank you.
Nimai Mehta from American University. One of the points you made was the desire to empower the states. And there's been a recent announcement that the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion is going to start publishing the ease of doing business in these different states. And that is an encouraging sign. But is there anything more than that that will either pinch these states or reward them?
I don't think the government has to pinch or reward. You see, I had added to this debate on Indian federalism by saying it's not merely cooperative federalism, it's also competitive federalism. And therefore, those who want to grow can't be prevented by those who don't want to grow. And therefore, you can't have one rule of thumb. And therefore, states one after the other must also compete with each other in attracting investment. So, easing processes of business is one of them. In fact, my biggest argument against the critics of the land bill has been that the law itself entitles the state to decide whether it wants to acquire land for any of these new purposes or not. And therefore, could West Bengal say, I don't want to acquire land, but I won't allow Gujarat to acquire land? So today, the position of the Congress party and others who oppose this bill is that even those states, well, Congress party is free to tell their chief ministers, don't acquire land under this new law. But why should they prevent a progressive state from acquiring land? And that is where I think competitive federalism in India has to be encouraged. That is, and one impact of this is, I went and supported the West Bengal government, not merely in unlocking some stalled projects, because one fact I didn't mention in the journey to 10% is that if you are able to start, a lot of them have started, but many of them have still to be started. But I also went and supported them at their investors conference. And I can assure you that the kinds of noises I heard there were not very different from the kind of noises I heard at the Gujarat Investors Summit. So the fact that West Bengal also has been compelled to speak the same language. Last week, Kerala, which had a great distaste for privatizing ports and so on, the state government decided to hand over a major port to a private sector company and ask them, please run this port for us as a competition to Colombo. So the fact that Kerala and West Bengal are being compelled to do this, I think is a good sign.
Two places down, Swaminathan Iyer.
Swami's there.
Hi, Swaminathan Iyer, the Times of India. If you look, I mean, since we started off with the idea of Thatcher and Reagan, actually Thatcher did very little in her first term. Wanted to get re-elected and then went for the Big Bang. Is there a policy within the BJP that in this term you are going to do things in slow incremental terms, and if you get re-elected, then you go for a Big Bang next time? I mean, it would be a defensible policy. I don't know that you actually thought it out. The way things are working out, it seems to me perhaps you're going that direction.
Swami, I've been following every word you write. And I am still trying to discover the meaning of Big Bang.
Shall I tell you?
I'll be educated on this.
Okay. Privatize the worst 10 banks. Say that you will abolish the railway board and have railway corporations within the next 5 years. With Deborah Committee. Have a program for police judicial reform where crooks are put in jail within 2 years. Just 3 things.
You see, when you let me take your third point and the first point. Crooks being put in jail for the right reason. In fact, when I say that people with assets abroad must pay tax, and if they don't do it, then penal action will follow, your colleagues in your paper say this is a draconian law. Therefore, I'm aware of the inherent limitations of these kind of suggestions. Now, when you speak in terms of privatize all the banks,
10 worst.
the 10 worst banks, in fact, there are only 26 of them which are in the public sector, we are bringing down the equity of the government down to 52% or let's say 51%. I am open to the suggestion of consolidation of some of the banks which are not performing, because that suggestion has been coming. But I still do feel that in promoting a large number of these projects, now stalled projects, it's eventually to these banks that we've been going and asking them to help us to rebuild the stalled projects. Are you aware of the fact that out of the 15.5 crore bank accounts as a financial inclusion, private sector banks had a contribution of 23 lakhs? And therefore, there's a lot of distance in these areas funding highway programs. I can still depend on the state bank to do it when the program is stalled. Not that the private sector is not doing it, the banks are performing extremely well. And therefore, we've reached a happy situation. I'd like to see more private sector banks doing well, more internet banking, more foreign banks investing into India. But at the same time, I am not willing to get blocked in one controversy and say, because one reform has, therefore that becomes symbolic that the government is helpless. I'd rather do those 300 things which are reasonably possible, and I think for the next 1 or 2 years, we have our agenda quite full.
My colleague from AEI, Derek Scissors, here in the front row.
I have another Big Bang reform suggestion, but I'm more interested in your thoughts about it. Labor market reform, which is obviously important to India, and it's actually, in fact, crucially important to the rest of the world given the size of the Indian labor market. The beginning of the government seemed to be that the labor market was a state issue, which is not an unreasonable position. We've now seen some signs that the national government is more willing to push, in addition to the states, on labor market reform. I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of whether the strategy has shifted, whether it's primarily to be led by the states, or whether the national government has particular reforms in mind for labor.
Well, can I tell you, labor market reforms are required. But then there is a silent change also which has been taking place as far as the labor market is concerned. And therefore, labor as an obstruction to economic growth, it's not a very serious issue as far as India is concerned. Now, we have made a few changes in the last 1 year in some of the laws, not very big ones, but we were able to get some of the unions on board. There are sectors where the size of the private sector is being encouraged and growing. For instance, take the banking sector. Now, one of the most powerful sector where the unions existed. And today you have with internet banking, with the ATMs, with the private sector banks, that entire impact is substantially diluted. And therefore, we've been encouraging as a process states to come up with. So Rajasthan was the first one which came up with it. Maharashtra has decided to come up with it. Gujarat has decided to come up with it. I remember during the earlier NDA government, Mr. Chandrababu Naidu had been openly advocating, and the present Prime Minister as Chief Minister Gujarat was advocating, allow us to do it. So the moment a couple of states come up and start doing reforms, and the centre has announced that the states which do it, they require ratification from the centre, we will ratify each one of them. Now, is that a faster course? Or is something big bang and not easily implementable a easier course? After all, the government has the serious issues of political management also to address. At the same time, achieve the results. And that's the course which we are adopting. I foresee a situation where one after the other, several states are going to come up with the kind of legislations they require in their states and ask for central's permission to go ahead with those changes.
Get someone right in the front, staying in the front row, Paul Wolfowitz.
Mr. Minister, thank you for being here today. It seems to me that one of the things that held back economic development during the Cold War was that many countries with newly independent countries tended to think of the Soviet Union as the sympathetic power and therefore follow the Soviet model, which produced the kind of disaster you were describing where people have no telephones or they have to wait 10 years for them. I'm curious to know, in the present world, if some African finance minister were to come to you and say, should we be following a Chinese model or an Indian model, how would you respond to them?
Well, countries like the United States and India, in terms of important decision making on these issues, run into difficulties with elected houses. And therefore, China doesn't have that problem. And not that I'm going to advocate that democracy is a liability because of this. I think it's a wonderful system. And even if my decision is delayed by a year or two, I'd rather live with democracy because these are the values which we cherish. But each country would have its own compulsions, would have its own requirements. For instance, I was asked this question yesterday at one of the meetings in New York as to whether you'll, between the American and the Chinese model, which one will you prefer? And I said I'd prefer the Indian model for my country because it's a model which is closer to a market economy, but which yet because of poverty levels in India, there is a social conscience to that decision making. And therefore, that's the requirement of India. I don't know the other country may have a similar requirement. I'm quite sure African countries will have a very similar situation to us.
Can we go here to the third row? Tanvi Madan.
Tanvi Madan from Brookings. Minister, you'd mentioned some of the things that could facilitate the journey to 10%. I wonder if you could mention a few key obstacles that you potentially see that could either stall that or slow it down, and any key regional or global shocks that worry you most.
You see, there will be occasionally decisions elsewhere in the world. So if something happens in Greece or the European Union, or something happens with regard to monetary easing in the United States, it will impact on us. But I think today we are far better prepared to face those consequences. I think the biggest challenge, because the biggest challenge for us is to keep our polity in place to be able to take the decisions which will lead us to that roadmap. If our politics loses its track, then the challenges are far stiffer.
I think we have time for one last question. Teresita Schaefer.
Teresita Schaefer from Brookings and McLarty Associates. I'd like to go back, Mr. Minister, to something you said earlier when you were talking about making an enabling environment for economic growth in India, and I believe you used the phrase policy stability. To my ear, that involves at least two ingredients. One is stability of the legal framework, and the other is stability of how it's administered. And I wonder if you could address the second of those things. My impression is that the decision to apply India's minimum tax to institutional investors was a substantial change in the way policy was being administered. I wonder if your government has a view on how to achieve the right degree of stability in administration along with fairness in administration.
You see, conventionally, the view in India consistently was that the minimum alternative tax is not applicable to the foreign financial institutions. And this was implemented for a reasonably long period of time. There was also a judicial opinion of the Advanced Ruling Authority which supported that. And all assessments were made accordingly. Now, notwithstanding that, somebody in the FII world went back to the Advanced Ruling Authority in the year 2012 and asked for a second opinion. I do not know why it was required. And that authority, headed by a Supreme Court judge, returned an adverse verdict saying it is applicable to you. Now, whether this was wrong or right, I'm not going into the merits of this. This was contrary to what the conventional understanding was. Now, in 2012, the government of the day did nothing. The FIIs also took it very lightly and allowed that verdict to remain and occupy the field. What does an assessing officer then do at the expiry of 3 years? He'll be hauled up for not following that verdict. At this stage, the FIIs represented to me, when this year's budget was being presented, that this will create a problem. So we responded by saying that with effect from 1st April 2015, we give a clarificatory amendment that it doesn't apply. And therefore, the problem for the future has been completely resolved. Now, for the 2012 verdict, then everybody got active in 2015 and now decided to mention it to the Supreme Court, please resolve this issue expeditiously. The government joined the FIIs and said, yes, we want it to be resolved immediately. Because it's a judicial verdict, it has to be set aside by a judicial or confirmed by a judicial process. The court has said now the summer vacations were coming. On the 3rd of July, the court reopens and we'll take it up for hearing immediately after that. So the tax, we have not imposed any retrospective tax. It's a legacy issue for the present government, an unattended opinion of 2012, a lethargy in dealing with that, and consequences which followed. The legislature has corrected it for the future. For the past, the dispute has to be resolved, and that can be resolved by a higher judicial authority reviewing that verdict. And that's what's going to happen.
Well, before I ask you to have a round of applause, I'd like to make one request, which is that the minister needs to leave for another engagement. So if you could just stay in your seats after we're done with this, that would be great for just 2 minutes. Thank you.